This is a complete reading of an article called The Incomplete Revolution. An Incomplete Revolution. Thousands of African Americans, both slave and free, fought in the American Revolution. Many slaves hoped the war would bring about their emancipation, but their struggle for freedom had just begun. March 5th, 1770 began like any other day in Boston, Massachusetts. Outside the city's custom house, British soldiers stood guard as they had for 2 years. Many colonists hated the soldiers, who were a reminder that they had to obey British laws. On that day, Crispus Attucks, a tall, near giant of a man, joined a crowd gathering at the custom house. A young boy was shouting rude remarks at a British soldier. Suddenly, the soldier lost his temper and struck the boy with the butt of his gun. The scene soon got out of hand. More colonists, armed with sticks and clubs, joined the mob. Frightened British soldiers fired into the crowd. When it was over, Atticus and 4 other Americans lie dead or dying. The skirmish, known as the Boston Massacre, was one of several incidents that led to the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. Crispus Attucks, an escaped slave, was the first of many African Americans to die in the long struggle for American independence. The struggle begins. The American Revolution began in 1775 when American soldiers calling themselves patriots fired at British soldiers in Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, sparking full-fledged battles. Approximately 25,000 to 30,000 African Americans, slaves, and free took part of the major battles of the Revolution, but they fought for different reasons than white colonists. Most white colonists who fought in the Revolution were angry because they had to pay taxes to Britain, yet had no representatives in Britain's parliament. They believed they had a God-given right to self-govern and freedom. King George III was taking away those rights, they believed. Many African Americans, however, fought because they wanted freedom from slavery. They were willing to fight for whichever side promised them independence. Whoever invoked the image of liberty, be he American or British, wrote historian Benjamin Quarles, could count on a ready response from African Americans. An offer of freedom. In 1775, the British, in desperate need of soldiers, promised liberty and protection to slaves who would fight on their side. Between 10,000 and 20,000 African American men offered their service to the king. The British used them as laborers, orderlies, scouts, and spies. Slaves made excellent scouts and spies because they knew the location of local roads and rivers, which British soldiers did not. The British also gave guns to African Americans. Lord Dunmore, British governor of the colony of Virginia, enlisted 500 slaves in what became known as Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. In a letter to England, Dunmore wrote, "My Negroes fought with skill and valor. Daily, new men arrived to join us." It was the first African American regiment raised by either side during the Revolution. Jupiter Charles was one of the slaves who fought in Lord Dunmore's regiment. Jupiter told his mother why he wanted to fight for the British. "Mama, I could stay and let them, his masters, work me into a younger grave, or I can fight my way and see how I end up. Besides, I have a score to settle." Many states desperately tried to prevent slaves from helping the British. The Virginia Gazette published frantic appeals for the loyalty of slaves tempted by Britain's offer. "Be not then, ye Negroes, tempted by the proclamation to ruin yourselves." American appeals often fell on deaf ears. A Baltimore newspaper described one incident in which 21 Maryland slaves stole their master's boat and sailed away to the British. Patriot soldiers. Britain's policy of recruiting slaves terrified many American slave owners. When the Revolution began, African Americans could not enlist in the Continental Army. Slave owners feared that slaves might rebel if they were given guns. But as the need for soldiers grew, free African Americans as well as slaves were allowed to enlist. Between 5 and 7,000 African Americans joined the Continental Army. Some did so because they believed in the ideals of freedom and liberty. Jehu Grant, who fled slavery and joined the Patriots, remembered, "When I saw liberty poles and people engaged for support of freedom, I could not but like and be pleased with such a thing." For slaves like Grant, the words of the Declaration of Independence had special meaning. All men are created equal, proclaims the Declaration, with rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For slaves who could get to Rhode Island, fighting for the Patriots brought freedom. In 1778, Rhode Island did not have enough white soldiers to send to the Continental Army. So the state declared that any slave who volunteered for the Rhode Island Regiment would be set free. Many African Americans responded to the call. One observer wrote, "3/4 of the Rhode Island Regiment consists of Negroes, and that regiment is the most neatly dressed, the best under arms, and the most precise in its maneuvers." Many slaves did not win freedom by fighting for the Americans. Some northern slave owners set their slaves to fight in their place. In some states, the master would receive the slave soldier's pay or even be reimbursed, paid back, if his property were killed. Only in a few states did a master have to free a slave before sending him to fight. Whatever their reasons for joining the Patriots' cause, many African Americans were rewarded for their courage and bravery. At the Battle of Bunker Hill, Peter Solom reportedly killed an important British officer and became a hero. Solom Poor, a free African American man, showed extraordinary courage during battle. 14 officers asked Congress to give Poor the reward due to so great and distinguished a character. James Armistead was a servant to General Charles Cornwallis, leader of the British forces. Armistead was a Patriot spy who reported everything he saw and heard to General Lafayette of the Continental Army. The information Armistead provided helped the Patriots defeat Cornwallis at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, the final battle of the Revolution. On the recommendation of General Lafayette, the state of Virginia bought Armistead from his master and set him free. From that day on, he called himself James Armistead Lafayette. Free at last? These are just a few of many stories of African Americans who served in the American Revolution. The stories of many more may never be found or told. What is known is that by the end of the war, more than 100,000 slaves were either freed or had escaped. African Americans would not forget their experience in the Revolution. The American victory established the colonists' right to self-government. But one important question remained unanswered. When would African Americans enjoy the freedoms they had fought so hard to win?